Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is episode 15. We keep on pumping them out. I'm actually kind of surprised at myself. but
Wow, it's divisible by five. So
yeah,
I'm a special guest star then, I guess.
yeah, look at that. So, my guest today is Mike Lewis, the founder of the website and podcast and YouTube channel, Where Peter Is. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's the Tuesday after Christmas, I guess, that we're recording this, and
Yep.
had a nice little Christmas. Unfortunately, in quarantine, but nobody's gotten sick. We got exposed right before Christmas, so hopefully we dodged a bullet there. But yeah, doing well. Got my family together, so it's things are going pretty well. How about you?
Going pretty good. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm sorry to hear about that. I had COVID earlier this year, back in April, and
Oh
it
man.
really, yeah, it sucked. So I was. It took me, I think, like a month to like physically recover, and then my taste buds and smell were messed up for like even. Well, even now, I'm still not over the that. It's not as bad as it was immediately, but like different things taste weird to me now. Like I love root beer, and I tried having root beer, and I'm like, this tastes like a bunch of toothpaste. What the heck
Oh
is going
wow.
on?
So it's
Yeah,
like
it
the
was.
sweet receptors are like doing something or
Yeah, I was
the
just like,
bitter
what is?
is yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've dodged a bullet. We went to a baptism maybe a month or two ago, and there were like five or six families there, and it was a little bit before Omicron was like known. It was probably like
Oh,
the tail end of Delta, but then, you know, 3 days later we find out that, one of the people there tested positive for COVID. And then we find out that, there were like four or five families there, and I think four different families had someone test positive for COVID, even
oh
after
no.
and some had been vaccinated. I mean, it was just like,
Yeah,
and
that
like our
sucks.
family got escaped scot free. So I don't know, either we've been lucky or we've, who knows?
Man,
So,
yeah, yeah. That's dang. That's unfortunate, but so prayers for all of them. That I know that definitely it's not a fun experience.
oh, well, I'm
So,
glad you're feeling better now, even if food tastes weird. Does anything taste better?
um, I don't know what it is because I told some friends and some, like my landlord too when I moved here to Steubenville because I'm from North Carolina originally. And I have to say, I don't know if it's like pollution from the steel mines or whatever it is, but I feel like everything in Steubenville tastes like it has so much like acid and salt in it. I don't know. It's
Oh,
just
wow.
it. Yeah, it's really weird. So because at first I thought it was just in my head, but then I went back to Raleigh for Thanksgiving, and I had food there. I had the turkey and stuff. I'm like, this tastes completely different. It tastes great and it was good, but I'm like, this is like, I have to say, North Carolina food,
So
10
you don't know
points.
if it's the COVID made it taste better or if it's just going back home and tasting
Yeah, I don't
the
know,
Southern cooking. Yeah.
because even at the airport, when I drove to the Pittsburgh airport to go to RDU, and even the food there, I stopped at a little shop in the airport and had some food there. And even that food, even Pittsburgh food, tasted way better than Steubenville. So I
Oh,
don't
wow.
know.
Who knows?
But yeah, so well, I'm really glad to have you on, Mike. And just for everyone, my listeners and viewers here, for context, I've mentioned this before. I mentioned this in my interview that I had with Pedro Gabriel on Amors Laetitia and its continuity with Familiaris Consortio. I also mentioned in the interview I had with Michael Lofton on the Pope's authority to change the liturgy, how you have influenced me, and so has Where Peter Is. And, you know, I went through back in 2019, and you know this too because we were in some of the same Facebook groups, and then also we had a long Facebook chat together since 2019 about various things on Pope Francis. And I was not a fan of Pope Francis. I was very much encaptured by Taylor Marshall, Timothy Gordon, Church Militant News. I was binge watching that, especially the year I was confirmed, 2018. Everything was great in my sort of Catholic life. I was just, I was a convert from Calvinism, from Protestantism. I was excited to be Catholic. I was going to mass. I was going to confession, and everything was great. And then the Summer of Shame, as it's called, came out with McCarrick and the grand jury report from Pennsylvania, and all these terrible things and abuses and corruption that got out. Then the dossier stuff and all of that.
The Vigano letter, I think, was that was a bomb that dropped for a lot of people. It rattled the church. Yeah. There's no getting around what that testimony did.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. But so I was just sort of, disenchanted. And, I talked to my friend William Albrecht, because I was even looking at like Sedevacantism, more so like conceptually, not like to actually attend. I was sort of like, if the theology between like Pius XII and St. John the 23rd had changed so radically, then one can't logically say that's the same religion. And I felt the moral obligation to leave, or at least try to look elsewhere. I also looked into Eastern Orthodoxy as well, and I even considered going back to Protestantism. I was like, hey, maybe I made a mistake here. Maybe the mistake was not staying Reformed and going into the errors of Rome, or whatever, as various Calvinists would say. But so that led me on a journey. I read a lot of your guys' articles from 2019. I read different books. I read, they're over there. I can't see it, but I read the Dictator Pope. I read Philip Lawler's Lost Shepherd, which that was the first one I read. And he started to say things in there that essentially boiled down to where, we can't trust Rome, and questioning the Second Vatican Council, which I was uneasy with, because I still had a very strong sense of sort of a hermeneutic of continuity, Ratzinger approach to things. So even though I was growing as like a little baby traditionalist, I still had some theological concerns. But and again, I binge watch hours and hours of Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon. But for me, the logical conclusion of it was not to stay Catholic; it was to actually leave, because I was like, who would want to stay in a church that it is this corrupt morally and also theologically? Because it also seemed like the logical conclusion of what they were saying seems to be that the church is defectible, and the gates of hell have prevailed, basically. But sorry, go ahead.
And I'm just to sort of give you a little bit of my own background. It's funny because I went through personally kind of all of those things.
Yeah.
But I did that like from 2008 until like 2012. And so like I had already, so it's like, I think that's kind of the thing that's like people come out and, think that like I'm this big leftist, or I'm, or I only like Pope. Well, if I, it's funny, I think probably across the board, I've liked Pope Francis more than other popes, but it was because I thought John Paul and Benedict were too liberal. It was because I grew up with a grandfather who was not a fan of Vatican II at all. Like, I think it traumatized him. They happened to belong to like, and I've mentioned this in other interviews, so it gets a little repetitive, but they lived right near a parish that just happened to be the ultimate like Spirit of Vatican II parish. Like, we're talking liturgical dancers, homemade bread, the priest, quoting heretical, Hans Kung and other people during his homilies. I mean, the type of like, apparently they once had a mass or something where everyone was supposed to like bring their own picnic basket with bread, and the priest, I mean, just like crazy innovative stuff. And I kind of wonder what he would have been like if he had just been at a regular parish or had a conservative priest and gone through that tradition. But apparently, like, looking at the history, there really was this silly season from the 60s that carried on through the 80s and I guess it happens in pockets today, but it certainly isn't part of, of my experience of the church. But so, I grew up hearing this rhetoric and reading, and then when I discovered the Catholic blogosphere, I gravitated towards the more traditionalist blogs, and, I would run up against these teachings that would be like, where you've got the hermeneutic of continuity people who would say, this kind of ecumenism is okay if it's interpreted in this way, but it goes too far. And then you've got like the SSPX that says, no, even that goes too far. It's got to be more like this. And then you've got the
Yeah.
sedevacantists who are saying the whole thing is heretical and just throw it out the window. And like, I'm like, well, how do you figure out which of these traditionalist groups, and traditionalist being a broad word from,
Right.
conservative Catholicism to sedevacantism, like how do you determine which one of these groups is actually orthodox? Like, what's the, and so I was like, is there a book or something that we're supposed to like? And here the Pope is saying, this, and, and I think like around 2009 is when, Sacramentum, what was it? Caritas and Veritate came out. The document by Pope Benedict, and George Weigel wrote an article in the National Review saying that, oh yeah, the Justice and Peace dicastery, they just added these parts. This is the real Benedict stuff. And he uses this image of like, you take a gold pen and you circle the parts that Benedict wrote, and then you take a red pen and you cross out the parts that came from the dicastery. And I'm just sort of like, wow, this guy is brilliant that he could figure this out. How did he figure that out? And I'm like, and around this time I started working for the church. In 2010, I started working for the church, and, got to know a lot of priests and theologians. And one priest I'm struggling over, I forget what issue it was, but like, I'm like, well, how do you know which of the Pope's teachings are orthodox? And he like looked at me like I had three heads. Like, what do you, he doesn't. And I mean, I think that's kind of a disconnect. I don't think like priests and theologians and bishops understand that this is the rhetoric that's going on among like us lay people that are trying to hash this stuff out. Like, they just take for granted, well, if the Pope promulgates something on an official level, and it deals with faith and morals, it's like if he says something to you, he was sitting across the table and he's like, if the Pope just says something to you from across the table, it's like, that's not magisterium. That's not binding. He's just speaking from one person to another. Right. He's like, if he puts something, promulgates it to the whole church, and it's on faith and morals, and he says, this is what the church believes, or this is what we believe as Catholics, or, that kind of indication, it's like, then look at Lumen Gentium here. It says religious submission of intellect and will. And I was like, really? But all these other people are saying, we can't listen to the Pope or the council when it says. And so that kind of set me on this journey of like reading about papal primacy and learning about the role of the Pope, and, how the relationship between the Pope and the bishops and the councils and the church, reformable teaching versus, dogma, or, how doctrine develops. And so like, I've got this all going on in sort of the JP2 Benedict sense going on in my head, which I think a lot of, my generation and earlier, we call, JP2 Catholics, like basically conservative American, middle class, popping out the kids, reading our, reading our Balthazar. Like, that was sort of the ideal. I wasn't that intellectual. I was, listening to Catholic Answers radio and stuff like that. But, but like, but it's like, I formed this idea like, oh, wow. Okay. So the Pope is the guarantor of orthodoxy. And when he says something, we can like, even though like, obviously there's development. And I think that's one of the issues that really, this is like, when I say this, I know traditionalists are going to be, jump all over it, but it's like, there's certain things that are reformable or can be expressed in a different way, or may even result in a new approach based on the sign of the times. It doesn't make one good and one, it doesn't make like, take an issue like limbo, right? And people can say, well, you don't have to believe in limbo, which, I mean, there, that seems to, the catechism doesn't talk about limbo. The Vatican level theological analysis is that it's, it's a theory. Now, there were popes that taught it pretty strongly back in the past.
Yeah.
But, obviously the idea, I mean, is something that's not taught by divine revelation. It's something that we don't know. It's something really, limbo and any theory about what happens to unbaptized, babies it's outside of what we've been taught by the deposit of revelation. And so you can believe in limbo, but somebody who believes in limbo can't, because the church has okayed the possibility of salvation or just entrusting them to God. You can't say that person is a heretic because they said, it's like the
Right.
teaching can
Yeah.
develop, and it doesn't mean that the old one is an error. It just means like we've got sort of a different sense of it. So anyway, then the Pope resigns. Pope Benedict resigns. I'm devastated because it's like I've grown in my faith. I've read his works. I've, learned a lot from him about encounter with Christ. Reading him about friendship with Jesus, and I think it was just little bits and pieces there in different writings of his, like, changed my life. Because unlike people who grow up Protestant, I had never heard. I thought being friends with Jesus was like a Protestant thing. I had never heard it in a Catholic sense before, and it wasn't part of Catholic spirituality. In 1950, basically, I grew up with an extended version of like 1950s suburban American Catholicism. It was about holiness, piety, sacraments, prayer, sacrifice, following the morals, and going to confession when you screw up. Like, that was it had nothing to do with, how am I growing in my encounter with Christ? How am I bringing Christ to others? It wasn't. And so it's like, I kind of broadened my sense of what evangelization was. Pope Benedict dies, and this, this kind of unpredictable guy from Argentina becomes Pope. And I'm like, okay, this is different. And some of the things that he did, especially because, as we are learning, you can draw a very strong line between, like, if there is a hardcore difference between the two of them in approach, personal philosophy, not doctrine, in the core sense, is liturgy. The two of them have totally different notions. Not that Francis is a liturgist, and Benedict, although he's not like trained as a liturgist, obviously he's written a ton. He has the book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. Definitely, I would say that he is very high church, very introspective. The symbols to Benedict, the ancient symbols with history behind them, with stories behind them. I'm not talking about like but I'm saying like, this vestment means this, and this, precious metal means that, and having this on the altar means this, and having this on the ambo means that, having this many candles here, here, and here means this. Pope Francis, he's fine with whatever the church says about it, but it's just sort of like, all right, we got Vatican II, we got to do this now. Whereas I think people who are more embedded into the thought of being a theologian and understanding liturgical reform, and who lived during the silly season, which, being a professor in Germany, a theology professor in Germany in the 60s, probably you saw some nutty stuff. I think that there's a difference there. And so, like, when Pope Francis is washing women's feet that first Holy Thursday, that was jarring, because I had been reading all the blogs, and Father Z, who loved the previous Pope, said this is against the rules. This is what it says. It means the priesthood. It means yada, yada, yada. But I was also kind of noticing, like, yeah, but it's also like, it's really resonating with like my lapsed Catholic friends, because growing up Catholic, it's like, it was sort of like my Catholic culture disintegrated when I grew up. I mean, that's sort of the 20th, 21st century experience, is all of your friends are ex-Catholics, or the ones you grow up with are ex-Catholics. And then you meet other Catholics along the way. So when, your friends on Facebook are like, hey, I haven't been to mass in 5 years, but this guy seems pretty cool. It's like, I can kind of see that this is resonating. Pope Benedict brought back the red shoes that popes wore. And I think there are pictures of John Paul wearing them earlier in the papacy, but even he had kind of dispensed with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then the news stories when Benedict was Pope and he's wearing the red shoes, it was right when the movie The Devil Wears Prada came out. And so they're like, the Pope wears Prada. And they're making fun of Pope Benedict for wearing these velvety red fancy shoes that supposedly cost an arm and a leg. And Vatican had to issue this statement that no, they are not from Prada. They're made by this like obscure cobbler in Italy. And the red means the blood of the martyrs, and then Pope Francis is like, no, I'm just going to wear my scuffy black orthopedics, and people are like, yeah, he's like a regular person, and it's like he had this sense of like, what are the people? What's going to resonate with the people, as opposed to what is going to make the Catholic intelligentsia, we've already got it all figured out, JP2 intellectual Catholics, they don't get Pope Francis. I didn't get Pope Francis. I was one of them. And sorry if I'm rambling too long, but this is
you're fine.
this is sort of that part of the journey. Like people just sort of think I'm like this agent that wants to promote leftism or something crazy like that. And it was like, no, it was like my own journey landed me at a certain point when Francis was elected Pope. And I had to make a conscious decision because I was starting to see the criticism a few months in. I had been, because I was working for the church and because of the nature of my job, I was able to like read his homily that came out every day and read his audiences. And it was just sort of like I felt like in a lot of ways he was speaking right to my heart. Yeah. And I had also been feeling a lot of hopelessness because we have this, or at least about the direction. I think like one of the things that people are always saying is, back in the JP2 days, it wasn't just traditionalism. It was like, a robust, dynamic orthodoxy will grow the church by leaps and bounds. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but in a lot of ways, it's also, if you have that priest and that parish, all the people who go to the dying parishes in the area, if there are multiple churches, will gravitate towards that parish. Who's actually coming into the church? Not that many people. Welcome, by the way.
Yeah.
James is coming into the church. You got James. And we're glad to have you too.
Good segue.
But yeah, so it was just sort of like, but then people are like, he's saying some things that are concerning. And like, for me, it was like, well, he's using certain language that Benedict would always follow up with like the full explanation. That who am I to judge line about gay people. And it's like, that statement in itself is true. Like, he is not in a place to judge the culpability, the life situation. I think in the, as a priest, maybe there's a little bit more, but it's like with me, if I find out somebody's struggling with something and then, or let's say I see someone do some horrible sin once, like, I don't know, adultery or what, get totally plastered and drunk and, whatever. Let's say drunkenness, like they get totally plastered and they make a fool of themselves and whatever. And I can judge that person. I can say that person, is horrible and I can't believe what they did and yada, yada, yada. But let's say I find out about this person and it's like, they struggled with alcoholism for a long time. They gave up drinking. They hadn't had a drink for 3 years. Some tragedy happened in their life and they had a relapse. Like, there's a lot more to that story. If that makes sense to you, it's like, okay, this person had been trying, this person had been meaning well. They had a really, really bad day, or really, they've been going through a very rough stretch. Like, let's have some empathy here. But instead I was seeing this piling on because he was saying these things like, this sounds like this, or people are saying this, oh, well, this is what the liberation theologians used to say, or this is what the liberal, this sounds a little bit like Hans Kung, and And so I started to look a little bit more closely at, like, I could kind of tell what he was doing, just like he's evangelizing. Like, he's not, like, he knows that. And I think that was the thing that, like, a lot of, like, quote unquote, like, Orthodox, devout, serious Catholics were not picking up on, because
Mhm.
I think they were used to being affirmed and having the choir, being preached to at the choir. I mean, Pope Francis has these, I'm sure you followed them because they're covered extensively whenever he does it, but his Christmas address to
Oh
the
yeah,
Roman Curia.
yeah.
And, like, one of the first ones, he gets up there and he says, like, these are the 10 sins, or the 7 deadly sins of bureaucrats. And I mean, it's sort of like corruption, or forgetting that people are treating people like numbers, and, just
Hmm.
sort of a list of basic, and, like, people are like, he insulted the Curia. And I'm, like, thinking to myself, like, he just lectured a bunch of bureaucrats about what they shouldn't be doing. Like, isn't that what you want to hear? But I think it was just because
Yeah.
it was him, that it's like he's, like, yelling at it, or they just took it as, look at how mean he's being. Or, when he says, like, priests shouldn't be rigid, they shouldn't, like, yell at people in the confessional. And they're like, and you see priest bloggers saying, he really hurt my feelings. And it's like, well, are you yelling at people in the confessional? Because if you are, you should stop. But if not, he's not, like, talking to you,
Right.
and,
Exactly. Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
think it was somehow this narrative got so powerful. And I think it peaked during that summer of shame in 2018,
Yeah.
which was 6 months after Where Peter Is started. And it was just like, I think people were just, like, on the edge of being ready to, like, throw up their hands and say, I give up on Pope Francis.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, I mean, the funny thing is, it's like, where are the victims of sexual abuse, which is what this started out as. How do they figure into this whole thing? It was a very cynical way to exploit that scandal, just to get the Pope, I think. And I mean, at least that's the way I read the situation. But, it was like, how do you push back against this? It's kind of what I was thinking. It was like, there's, I mean, I guess what we can do is just sort of, like, wait for the details to come out and remain open to things as they happen. I mean, I knew that there were a couple of things in there that were errors in Vigano's letter, but people weren't listening, because I live in the Archdiocese of Washington and I worked for the church, and and my brother was in seminary up through that time, and now he's a priest. But it's like the time that it's like, I know that when I was in Rome in 2011, so Vigano was already the nuncio, and this was during the period where McCarrick was supposedly in sanctions, supposedly in house arrest. Francis hadn't been elected yet. Benedict was still Pope, so he hadn't lifted anything. And, you go to the diaconate ordination mass for the North American College, and there's McCarrick celebrating right next to the prefect of the CDF at the time. And I'm like, well, I remember I saw him there. He wasn't under house arrest. And then I was like, and he also said mass at the USCCB these times, and he went to these like, I don't remember it, like, exactly like this. I didn't know what the story was. And it was like, well, if Francis knew about this, he should have done something. But it was
Right.
like,
Yeah.
but it seems to me that McCarrick was kind of always given free range. And, not that it's good, but, like, worst case scenario was Francis just continued what his predecessors had done with McCarrick, which even that kind of is an
Yeah.
iffy
There's. Yeah.
proposition.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like just to sort of, like, but the thing is, the reason why I knew that, or why it didn't add up to me, was because I was just so close to the situation, and I understood how things worked, and and I followed it really closely, and I wanted to give Francis the benefit of the doubt. So it was like, if there was concrete evidence, like, I didn't want to, like, grasp at straws. But like, if there is like, okay, you know, Vigano said he was under house arrest from this date to this date, and here he is making these 5 or 6 public appearances, including a couple with Vigano during that period. Like, that doesn't add up. But I think, you know, anger at the Pope had reached a peak high, and that's sort of where we appeared on the scene, which in some ways was providential, but in other ways was kind of terrifying
Yeah.
from my perspective, because I'm like, why, you know, I used to read your blog every day, and now you're like blocking me and, you know, calling me a heretic, and, you know, so yeah, that's kind of the trajectory, and kind of what's behind it is, you know, and you don't want to be like an authoritarian, because you don't want to be like, you know, just because I say so. But for people who insist that they're strict Catholics, it's like papal authority is a thing, you know, and you can't just ignore it and throw it out the window and call yourself Orthodox and call the Pope a heretic. So
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Mike. You know, it's interesting. So what I might do, because you actually have answered a few of the questions I was going to ask you. No, you're fine.
You got me going.
The first question, well, actually, this is just sort of by way of introduction, going more of like my experience with you guys is, you know, I've really been influenced by Mark Howsam that you have writing for you guys, Pedro Gabriel, as I mentioned before, David Lafferty, who I'm going to try to have on the show in January. I want to read actually Taylor Marshall's Infiltration, and then read his articles refuting it, and go over that, because I think that there needs to be more refutations of Taylor Marshall on YouTube. So
and with David, it's like, you know how you can just like push the start button on me and then I start talking. Like with David, it's just sort of like give him a topic and he'll just
here's an
he'll just take it down the home stretch.
Yeah, here's a 2,000 word book. Here you go.
Plus, he's got like that deep. He's got that deep, resonant bass voice. You know, it's just
it's very soothing to listen to.
I know, and the Canadian accent just adds a little bit more to it, because he's always very sorry for the things.
That's great, but yeah. So other than Lafferty, also Paul Fahey and Stephen Walford. Which I really loved his book on Amoris Laetitia, on divorce and remarriage. I'm forgetting the title, but I read the interviews that you had done with him on your article. They were excellent and amazing book. That book was very helpful for me. I read that earlier this year, around January of 2021 this year. And the thing I loved about it was, well, first, it has a preface from the Holy Father himself. So that's kind of important. And it's really important, too, how the Holy Father himself talks about how he affirms the hermeneutic of continuity, and that's basically the church's interpretation. And then he also affirms the sort of doctrinal development of St. Vincent of Lerins applied to the church's hermeneutic, which I was just like, that really got me. I was just like, ooh, because I'm really interested in the doctrinal development. And of course, Pope Francis canonized St. John Henry Newman. So that's also very fitting too, with that whole theology and type of theological methodology there. That helped really get me, as someone who really likes reading theology, to come around on Amoris Laetitia. That was very helpful.
And I just want to add, because I didn't really, I mean, Stephen Walford actually plays sort of a huge part in my own journey, because this resistance by the time Amoris Laetitia came out, it was it was pretty full force. It was at least I would say the theological part of it was in full force. I think in 2018 is just sort of when the whole structure got shaken. But it's like, I read Amoris Laetitia, I read, maybe Austin Ivory and Rocco Buttiglione and a couple of bishops wrote defenses of Amoris Laetitia. And then the story kind of dried up, from the defense side of it. And this is kind of what I find, and this is why I feel like where Peter is, this is the vacuum that where Peter is was meant to step into, or um, decided to step into, was it's like I was aching to like read more that defended the Pope, that clarified these questions that people were having. And when Stephen Walford's first article appeared in La Stampa, in Vatican Insider, called Amoris Laetitia, where truth and mercy embrace. And I'm like reading this, and um, I was like, yeah, this is, and it was written from a very, very devout, you could tell just sort of that conservative Catholic upbringing, and I mean, I use the words conservative and liberal loosely, but just sort of that, um, just really, really cared, really devotional, really devout, really pious, really, like a really, really deep Catholic, the type of Catholic who, in my experience, almost universally turned on the Pope. But he's using this kind of approach to defend the Pope. And he's doing it with charity, with reason, strong argumentation. And so, I think after the first or second one, I looked him up on Twitter, and, okay, this looks like the same guy. And then I messaged him, and, we started this back and forth, and and he really helped me kind of understand where he was coming from, and we got to know each other. I did a little bit of, like, he would send me something he was working on, and then I'd give him suggestions, and then he'd, disregard all of them, but thank me very much, very politely, in his, in his British way. But, I recommend, and he, I was surprised because he put it in the acknowledgments, or in the, one of the, the opening parts of his book on Amoris Laetitia, that it was me who said, hey, you should take these articles and like kind of beef it up and make it into a book. And so he did. And while he was doing that, he and I were talking pretty regularly. And I think I was laid off from work during that period. And he was very supportive, and said a lot of prayers. And, I think I lost, my mom got sick, and, just sort of different life tragedies were going on for us. So we were very close for a long time. And, on Twitter back in the olden days, like he and I, like 1 Peter 5 had just started. So like he and I would be like debating with Steve Skojek, plus like this whole band of trolls. And so like we'd put out an argument, like Steve Skojek would throw back some like insult and like have like 33 likes, whereas like Stephen and I would just be going back and forth, and we each have 1 like from each other as we're going through this argument, and it was like, so this is like the pre Where Peter Is days. Stephen wrote his book, and he, I think at a certain point he realized, just like, these, it's not gonna, like, arguments and reason, and I mean, I commend him for just doing whatever he wants with his life, but he's a pianist by training. He's composed, he's and he makes his living by teaching. And he just I've asked him in the past if he, has doubted himself, or if he had any questions about what he said about the Pope. And he says, he's like, never. I've never, I've always, conviction wise, it's like this is what I believe God was calling me to do. But at a certain point, I think it wasn't, he's like, this is not me. I'm not like this public figure. I'm not, I'm not this person who wants a platform. I just want to serve the Holy Father. And so to some degree, I think he bowed out. And, and I don't blame him, because it can be pretty grueling, honestly. But I think his standing forward in favor of the faith, and in favor of just sort of, this is what the church teaches about the Pope, really, sort of spoke to me as to like, this is what a layperson can make an impact. And there were a group of people, Paul Fahey, Pedro Gabriel, and Brian Killian and I were kind of talking about this on, just sort of in group chats and stuff. And it's like, why don't we start like a blog or something? So we prayed about it and I came up with the name. And we just sort of launched at the beginning of 2018 and just put out a post every once in a while. But but Stephen Walford's book was featured in it. We were kind of, we asked him if he'd contribute, and he has a couple of times, but it's sort of like, that's not where his game is right now. And so,
Right. Yeah.
God bless him. And I talk to him every once in a while. And, but I mean, he was a, it's like these people, like, you might have a high school teacher or middle school teacher that's like huge in your life. And then it's just, you move on to the next stage of your life and, it's, you're still friends, but it's like that, and I'm really grateful for the time that we got to know each other. So,
Yeah.
And maybe someday we'll collaborate on something else, but yeah, so that's my Stephen Walford story.
Yeah, that's awesome, because I mean I'm still trying to get him on the show. We've been talking. Me and him have been Facebooking over the course of this year. When I first read his book, I was asking him some follow-up questions with it and clarification, which is nice when you're Facebook friends with the author of the book you're reading.
Yeah.
And then I think it was in October or November, I asked if he wanted to do an interview, but he's pretty busy right now. So hopefully in January or February, I can have him on. But I had, Pedro on about Amoris Laetitia. I had Dr. Matthew Levering on, who doesn't go as far as Pedro Gabriel in terms of Amoris Laetitia, but Dr. Levering's thesis is that Pope Francis's doctrine of the indissolubility of marriage is the same as the Catholic Church's perennial teaching, and that it's orthodox. And Dr. Levering would want to say, if anyone tries to question that, then they would be wrong. So he's not a massive, from what I could gather, because I was limited in the interview I did with him. He's not a massively pro Pope Francis person, but he's definitely not a radical traditionalist. I mean, he's done several books on Vatican II defending it, and so he's definitely the hermeneutic of continuity group, and he's a very great scholar and theologian. And I actually plan on trying to do a part 2 with him, to sort of unpack more of his thoughts on.
No, and I mean, honestly, like, that's where I wish that the real debate was. I wish it was about these prudential issues. I wish, I kind of feel like, I mean, I'm more familiar with Larry Chapp's work. And it's like my thinking towards Larry's work is like, okay, well, these are like valid gripes and stuff, but I mean, we're talking about like a schismatic revolution going on right now, not whether the Pope is, totally up to your, standards when it comes to X, Y, and Z. And I mean, that's sort of my off the cuff take, but I think he does recognize the severity of the radical traditionalist problem. It's just, I think maybe because he and I are different generations, he was there during the silly season. That was his time in seminary. That was his time, those were his formative years. And at least my impression is, to a large extent, I mean, it seems like there's a little bit of that there, but in terms of, I mean, people denying the resurrection or denying the real presence, like the 70% of people who don't believe in the real presence, I don't think they're denying it so much as they don't know the teaching, or they don't care, or it's not interesting to them. Like I like what I see as a drifting away more than an ascendant heretical Catholic left. I mean, it's especially based on what my mom and my grandfather told me about. I mean, these people are cream puffs nowadays, or very marginal. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it really looked like things were headed in that direction, I think, down in the 60s and 70s. But and I think we needed John Paul and Benedict to a large degree to solidify things. But um, I think in terms of the pendulum and in terms of where the priorities are, especially when it comes to the Western Church and the U.S. Church, there, there are certain things that we need to do to evangelize, and I think Pope Francis is kind of unlocking the key to that more than, say, Benedict. At least, like Benedict, it was more like let's shore up the doctrine of Catholics and make sure they understand. I mean, putting out the catechisms during the JP2 era, but that was huge. Let's sort of lay down some roots. But once you've got those roots set out, the question is, how do you treat the people who don't follow that or who don't know that?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
what's your next question? Or go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me. My first two questions that you sort of answered was, one was, what is your faith journey? Were you always Catholic? Are you a convert or a revert? Is there anything to that you would like to add, or do you think you've said it all?
I've said it all. I mean, cradle Catholic, always practicing, but like a lot of just sort of the way I've approached my faith has definitely evolved along the way. I don't think I mean, nothing dramatic in terms of that. So.
Gotcha. And the second question you also talked a lot about too, is, tell us about the story of where Peter is. Why did you start where Peter is? What motivated you? When did you start? Is there anything with that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I think you can edit that out, because I think what I gave you, like I've talked the chronology before that really, but it was really sort of, I gave you the story going back to, 2008. So
yeah, so that's good.
So it's sort of like, and then talking about Stephen Walford, I think it kind of arcs into, like, I didn't give you the whole, like, as the site evolved story, but I think you got some good original material there that,
Okay.
lays the foundation. So
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to comment though too is, I think with the statistics on a lot of Catholics not believing in the real presence in the United States, I think one thing too that is often overlooked, but also simultaneously acknowledged as well, kind of paradoxically, is how just nominal many U.S. Catholics are, if not,
yeah.
I mean, I would say pretty much most, because I mean, I know growing up as a Protestant with many Catholic family, I did not get the impression that they really believed Catholic teaching. I mean, there came a point to where even when I was a convinced Protestant, I knew more Catholic theology than my relatives did, which that's nothing impressive, because I mean, to be perfectly honest, and I think most people would recognize that, because the reason why it's not that impressive is because most many people in nominal Catholic families don't really know the faith that well. And this could go into a whole other issue, but there's a lot of ways in which, both on the left and the right, politics has replaced religion, or what religion used to be in our society and in the West in general. And so politics is kind of more of its own religion now, and to such an extent that the reason why there's such, I think part of the reason why there's many ideologies in the church of left and right is because of that backdrop of the change in politics and religion, A, and then B, religion is then read in the light of the politics.
Oh yeah.
And so then it's sort of when I listen to different people, their emphasis and concern is obviously more clear to me about being a right-wing person than it is about being an actual Catholic, and vice versa with those on the left. And I'm like, this is exactly what Pope Francis talks about ideology. So I don't know if you have thoughts
Well,
on that.
and I found it kind of frustrating because, I mean, one of the things that the purpose of the site is to try to draw people back into, like, what is Catholic teaching, what is Catholic social teaching, how does Catholicism approach the poor and the needy, and people who are out of work and people who are in prison, and so I can kind of understand why people on the left maybe gravitated to at least nominally supporting us more. on social media. Um, Plus, I hate to say this, but in general, they seem to be nicer people. But I mean, even if they don't agree with you, it's they know how to. Whereas on the right, at least, on social media, I think people are just, can sometimes just be really cruel or dismissive. Um, but as the election approached, I was getting so many submissions about, that would throw in a barb about Trump or would throw in a barb about Biden. And I would say most of the submissions came from the left. And I had to just outright reject a lot of pieces. I'd get one, if I got one that was about the death penalty or that was about um, poverty or immigration, it's like, okay, well, this, this one here is sticking to Catholic social teaching, and I can cross out this one sentence that mentions how evil Trump is, and um, but also I just being a pro-life person who believes in the right to life of the unborn.
Mhm.
We wanted to make it clear that the Catholic position is both, and the Catholic position does defend the right to life. And I want to commend Pedro, especially because he felt that we weren't paying close enough attention to and I think part of it was even, and I don't I don't really want to, I hate to say it, but it's like for me, I took a step away from American politics in like 2012. Part of my whole process, it was just, so even before Francis became Pope, and it's like I just want to approach what's going on in the world from a Catholic perspective. So that's sort of where I developed my positions on immigration and healthcare and poverty and employment and all these kinds of things. And and I'm not a big economics guy anyway, so it's like tax, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Other people do that for me, and I they're great people. Um, but but yeah, so it was like I wasn't even thinking in terms of the election. And I would get these just sort of comments and this pushback. You're helping Trump. You're hurting Biden. You're hurting Trump. You're helping Biden. And like, and even internally among the contributors. And it was sort of like, oh, this is just giving me a headache. Something would happen in the election and it would have to be, and and it's like, okay, and um, I like Black Lives Matter, obviously, like that, the racism, it was a huge issue. And I think my eyes actually, because of the radicalization that occurred on the right, like you look at QAnon and you look at some of these other issues that are going on, like that, like growing up, like I didn't grow up in the South. I don't know how suburban or urban your upbringing was, but like I grew up in a place where like, just very, like I grew up conservative in a very blue state. So it's sort of like we're reaping the benefits of civil rights because, live in a very integrated neighborhood, live in a very,
Mhm.
have friends of all races, friends intermarrying, doesn't, like almost colorblind. Um, and I didn't see maybe the wider picture in the country, things that are happening. And so it's, that became, really difficult to navigate because it was so tied to politics.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I mean, one thing that I wanted to make certain of was, if we do cover these movements, like we have to deeply address it from a Catholic perspective, from human dignity, from from God. Everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. And so like to me, it didn't matter so much that this side was, as long as we stood up for the Catholic principle that was, that's embedded in almost every issue. There's a Catholic approach to it.
Right.
Um, but oh man, we were just basically called leftists. And it was like my mind was so far from the election. Oh, and the other thing that, I mean, when Pope Francis's critics became so deeply embedded in the Trump administration, it was, or campaign, Vigano's letter, Taylor Marshall, it became really, really hard to and I wanted to make the separation like, okay, it's one thing if, you're pro-life and this is the most important issue to you, and just your conscience tells you, this is who you should vote for. But I think any Catholic, of goodwill, who cares about their faith, should be able to look at either Trump or Biden and see, like, this guy doesn't line up with what the church teaches. This guy doesn't line up with Catholic values.
Yeah, yeah,
But I found people like really, really going in deep for the candidate, as opposed to, I'm voting for this candidate because. And that, oh man, when the election was over, I was just like, so, well, actually, no, probably like three months after he was inaugurated, I was like, okay, things have finally died down. Because I mean, I really just didn't like that. I was like, we're not going to endorse a candidate. We're not going to endorse a political party.
yeah, yeah.
We're going to try to avoid we're going to make this distinction. We're not going to condemn people for voting a certain way. We're going to present the issues and let people know that this is, so anyway, but yeah, no. And it was so frustrating because I found that people are willing in a lot of cases just to compromise on an issue.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, I mean, I can understand I'm holding my nose and I'm voting for this guy, even though I can't stand him personally, or I can't stand his position on this issue, and I can't stand, but instead I find that Catholics, rather than influencing their political parties, they're being influenced by their political parties and becoming less
Yeah.
Catholic.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was saying before, and I don't know if I should mention the name. Maybe I'll get in trouble, but why not? I think someone that's a really big example of that is Timothy Gordon. He seems to me to be very ideologically political and reads his religion in light of his right-wing politics instead of doing what you're doing and what St. John Paul II has done. And I think it's very clear, especially in a lot of to be honest, a lot of calumny and detraction and things he has said about the Holy Father in terms of his person. I'm all for criticizing popes and stuff, but like he's crossed a line, I think. And I'm saddened how so many Catholics are just okay with that. And it makes me kind of sad. Like, why does this person get so many views where I feel like he's kind of spouting nonsense and then saying things that are untrue and unfair, when there are people that are more balanced out there that have done more research and work, like Stephen Walford, like Pedro Gabriel. And I'm just like, I don't get it, to be honest. Like,
It's interesting because I think this is one of the disconnects when it comes to popular apologists. I think that the institutional church has left a very they've neglected it to a very large degree.
yeah,
I mean, I even remember when I worked for the USCCB. I mean, they knew about like this person that worked for this diocese that ran this program. They knew about this initiative that this bishop was behind. They would know about this university or these theologians. But like Scott Hahn, who's he? And I think that, and not to single him out, but it's just sort of like, there's a Catholic radio station. What? Catholic Answers? Who? And it's just sort of like, there's this like popular Catholic world that where people like Taylor Marshall and, Vigano and Timothy Gordon and Matt Fradd and all the Catholic Answers apologists are like, they're huge. And the thing is, they sell more books, they draw bigger crowds. You've got these apparition movements, like the Warning, Father Michel Rodrigue, Charlie Johnston. You've got like these unapproved visionaries who go around the country giving talks or sell videos and books that the bishops have never even heard of. Bishops. I got into contact with a bishop one time because of somebody who lived in their diocese that was doing, that was promoting false vision, or like a false or unapproved visionary that was saying some pretty wild things. And I got a letter back from the chancery, from like the chancellor saying, "Oh, well, thank you very much, Bishop so and so was unaware of this person and yada yada yada. And I'm like, how? Like this is what this person's got 300,000 people in their Facebook group, and you don't know this person exists. Like this person is more influential in your diocese than you are. I mean, that's the crazy thing. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's yeah.
I am more influential, and this is not a good thing. And I'm not that influential. I am more influential, I would say, probably than half of the bishops in this country, if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and then you look at somebody like Taylor Marshall, you look at somebody like Raymond Arroyo, you look at somebody like, who Vigano, who's in hiding somewhere, who doesn't have a diocese. Like these people are all much more influential on, national, international platforms than our real leaders are. And our real leaders, or our, the leaders are shepherds that, from apostolic succession and, from the being successors to the apostles, are kind of oblivious to all this going on. And, honestly, the job that I'm doing should have been done by the bishops, years ago to kind of.
Yeah, I agree. It's, Bishop Barron has talked about this too, how many older Catholics, clergy and non, are in a significant way, and not trying to be pejorative or unkind here, but just they're disconnected from how important social media actually is and how transformative it is of the 21st century society.
Oh yeah.
And that's why Bishop Barron started Word on Fire, because he
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
and we're talking about an auxiliary bishop.
Yeah.
It's like who is known around the world.
Right. Yeah.
I couldn't, I don't know who the other auxiliary bishops are in Los Angeles. And there's an Irish one, I think, named something Irish. And, and everybody knows Gomez, but it's like, in terms of, the bishops that people know in the US are the ones that are given platforms. And that includes Strickland, and that includes Cardinal Burke, and it includes, it's like there's nobody. I admire a lot of what Bishop Barron does. I don't quite get the whole like hanging out with Jordan Peterson thing, but the thing is, it's like there shouldn't be this much attention on just Bishop Barron. The reason why there is this much attention on Bishop Barron is he's one of the few like mainstream bishops that even has, that anybody even knows who he is, and let alone, and he has a media company. Granted, but it's like, nobody knows who, I don't know how many bishops there are in California, but I'd be willing to bet that, of all of them, the one with the most name recognition is Bishop Barron. But the other thing is, Catholics don't, the percentage of Catholics who pay attention to Catholic media and Catholic news is extremely low too.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
So, but I think that kind of steers where things go, in the church. And so I think that might be one of the things that about Pope Francis that people don't get, is the things that he does don't necessarily appeal to the typical Catholic media consumer. And that, like what I'm saying, like with those friends that I had that hadn't been to church in 5 years or whatever, and all of a sudden Pope Francis appeals to them, and they start thinking, maybe I should start thinking about this. I'd like to see like a new generation pop up. Then you hear these people that say, oh, well, I got off Twitter because it was super toxic, or, oh, I don't have time for that, I'm too busy doing X, Y, and Z. It's virtuous. Obviously sticking on social media too long can't be too great for your health, mental and otherwise. But it's like, if I was a bishop, I would have a few people on staff who are keeping tabs on things and then keeping me updated about what's going on.
Yeah.
It's like there are problem priests in every diocese that, either they're really heterodox on the left or they're really heterodox on the right. They're, spreading dangerous messages. They're promoting false apparitions. They're and I mean, I don't know, 8 out of 10 bishops, you can't even get a hold of them. You get some chancery office maybe, and you get the runaround, but it's like they're not accessible. Now this is turning into a gripe fest about bishops doing their jobs
Yeah.
wrong, but
Yeah, if you know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I want to. So I want to ask you.
Sorry,
I know
we're a little over time.
no, you're okay. I always have more questions than I have time to answer, so I'd love to have you on for a part two.
Sure, you got a lot of good stuff out of me, though.
I did. Yeah, I know. I agree. But so Mike, here's a question, and I know you've talked about this a little bit, but I kind of wanted to focus it into this question: is why even defend Pope Francis? Why bother? He's clearly a liberal, many critics say. Why even defend him?
Well, I think there are two reasons, and there are two planes on which he needs to be on which I defend him. There's one that's absolutely essential, and I touched on this earlier. I think that there is a problem. It began as a traditionalist problem. It has its roots in Archbishop Lefebvre, but it really is central to almost every major schism that we've had in the history of the church. Martin Luther, the Old Catholics, which is the role of the Pope and papal primacy. The idea that the Pope is the guarantor of orthodoxy, the idea that the successor of Peter is the principal source of doctrinal unity in the church, the fact that the Pope and the bishops in communion with him are the authentic interpreters of scripture and tradition. These are all doctrines that are taught by the First Vatican Council and have been and obviously there's seeds of that prior to the council, but the unanimous teaching of the popes and the Second Vatican Council are in accord with what I have been saying. You might not like a pope's style. You might not like his personality. He could be a sinner. He could be a scoundrel. He could be a very personally corrupt and greedy person. But when it comes to his official teachings on faith and morals, the Catholic Church tells us to trust in those teachings, to trust in the magisterium, even when the Pope is not teaching in a definitive manner. So it's possible that, for example, Amoris Laetitia, which I believe is Orthodox, which I believe is fits within the Catholic understanding of marriage and mortal sin and reception of the Eucharist worthily. I think it all fits there. I believe that you could possibly say from a prudential point of view, John Paul II figured it out better, or had a better approach. I think that it's possible that this could lead to abuses, sure. But when it comes to he promulgated heresy, that's a line that goes too far, or doctrinal error. This is doctrinally erroneous. And if you accept this teaching as the Pope taught it, you are in error. That's contrary to what the church has always taught. And I know that there are a lot of traditionalists who will say that the First Vatican Council only defined infallibility in very, very, very narrow cases. From what I can tell, however, because that's part 4 of Pastor Eternus, the document on papal primacy. Part 3, however, talks about papal supremacy, also papal primacy, and papal authority, more broadly speaking. And it basically says that the doctrine of the faith has been passed down through the papacy unblemished. and that the Pope has full, immediate, universal and universal authority, which he can exercise unhindered. And our canon law says the first see is judged by no one. I think it's canon 1404. There are no checks and balances on the Pope, which to me indicates, and I mean, this is what Pius IX, Pius X, Leo XIII, John Paul II, Pius XII, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis have all taught this. Probably Pope Pius XI too, but I can't remember quote offhand. That the Pope is the person who solves these doctrinal disputes. If you can't rely on the Pope for something that serious, then the whole thing falls apart. The Pope is the check and the balance. It's not the Pope. And I mean, you can either accept this or you can accept the crisis of faith that comes along with not being able to wrap your mind around it. And I think that in the case of a lot of traditionalists or a lot of papal critics, the reason why they're calling themselves Orthodox and the Pope erroneous, which is, it's like, you can't say what the church teaches. You don't have that authority. It's that you can't accept what the church teaches, which means that you should, but I mean, what really should happen at that point in a healthy faith journey would be to struggle with that teaching and wrestle with it and to pray over it and to try to understand it and to go into dialogue about it. They want to skip the dialogue and say, no, he's wrong, and everybody who agrees with him is wrong, and we're right. In terms of, so that's the primary level. And if everybody was on board with that, I might even be one of the papal critics, because I wasn't oriented towards, people call me a leftist, but it's like, I was conservative. Like, I was a conservative Catholic. I mean, I still am. It's funny because the contributors to Where Peter Is, it's like, all of us like agree with the church's teaching on birth control, which like puts us in the most conservative, like 5% of all Catholics in the church already. And they call us leftists.
Yeah.
Like that's the crazy thing. But the other reason is that I actually have learned a lot from Pope Francis. I mean, I've found that his writings and speeches and homilies and talks about encounter with Jesus, about the faith journey, on openness to other people, on forgiveness, on conversion. I mean, that's the funny thing. It's like he's preaching on repentance and conversion all the time, and they're cherry picking, like, I mean, he's an Argentine. He's going to say crazy stuff. Like that's all my Argentine friends say crazy stuff. But it's like this, that's the message that, and it's very repetitive, but it's also, it can be very insightful. And a lot of times he's responding, he'll use it in a context that responds to a unique problem. So on a prudential level, I also support Pope Francis. And I defend him in that way. And I think that's where a lot of people think that I'm like this ultramontanist, or that I think the Pope is like an oracle. Sometimes like the Pope makes decisions and people actually like those decisions. Like when Summorum Pontificum came out in 2007, you weren't Catholic. You're probably in like third grade back then, but you're a young guy. But when that came out, I remember people saying that it was a bad idea, or, oh, we shouldn't do this, or, oh, it's gonna, I don't think I was as attuned to people, but I believe there were people saying like, this is gonna like open the floodgates to like traditionalism, to like traditionalism, like the ideology, to, basically Lefebvreism. Other people were just like, oh, we can't. I just dismissed them. Okay, boomer wasn't a phrase yet back then, but it's like, we can't dial the clock back. We need to move forward. And it's like, no, all the young people like, tradition. And, I mean, I was on board with all that. But it's like, people would get mad when people would say, no, he shouldn't loosen the restrictions on the Latin Mass, that's a prudential matter. And there are prudential matters that people feel very passionate about. I mean, when I was, I mean, I used the example when I was on Michael Lofton's podcast. It was like, let's just say I really like the St. Louis Jesuits. I really like folk music. That's my favorite music. I think it should be at every mass. I think we should sing to the mountains, sing to the seas. It should be the opening hymn every single mass in the Catholic Church. It's a terrible, terrible opinion to have.
Yeah.
It's not heterodox, but it's a really stupid opinion. Let's say you like Gregorian chant and you don't like my opinion. We might have a very impassioned argument about whether or not Sing to the Mountains should start off or whether it should be the entrance antiphon, right? And we could get really angry at each other over this. It doesn't mean that you're a bad Catholic. It doesn't mean that I'd be a stupid Catholic, but I'm not, it's like, I'm not advancing heresy. I'm just advancing bad music, and so it's like, people are like, there are different, you don't have to defend the Pope about everything. It's like, I know, but I'm defending him about this because I agree with him on this, and so,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's funny because I think when Michael Lofton and I kind of had a dialogue about it before I was on his show, it was like, he doesn't like him. He doesn't like the Pope, really.
Right. Yeah. He doesn't like Pope Francis.
He
Yeah.
doesn't like Pope Francis, but he understands his authority. He understands. And I think when we work from that baseline, just like with Larry Chapp, like when we work from the same baseline of what is essential and then what prudential matters we don't agree with, okay, maybe Pius the sixth is your favorite Pope. I don't know anything about Pius the sixth, but it's like, I like Pope Francis. I like, I like Julius II because he painted the Sistine. I mean, it's his personal preference. I mean, not that it doesn't matter, or not that certain popes weren't better at certain things, and not that history doesn't tell us after the fact. I think when we're living in the fact, it's a lot harder to tell. I mean, I think history will look well on Pope Francis. But that's a prudential thing, and I understand it's a prudential thing, but I'm going to defend the prudential stuff along with, and I'm going to defend the essential stuff. It's like, I just happen to like him. Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, I really appreciate that.
I'll take another one or two if you want to, or are you
sure.
good?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because I think the one.
Feel free to chop out whatever you want.
Where was the? Hang on, I'm trying to.
Tradiciones.
Okay,
that might be too long. We could do a whole other one on Tradiciones.
Yeah, I was about to say a whole interview on the blog you recently did would be required.
Okay, because I'm actually writing a follow up to that. So maybe once that one's out in the new year, maybe we can do another one.
I guess this is fitting as the last question. What do you hope to accomplish at Where Peter Is in 2022 and beyond?
So, in terms of what I hope to accomplish, I think that on the whole, what we are trying to do is to present the case for Pope Francis from a faithful Catholic perspective. I think people who are, who maybe don't like Pope Francis, or they're confused, or they don't understand something that he did or said. I mean, the whole Amazon Synod thing, like, we were the only game, out there that was sort of giving, the mainstream media is covering the Synod, the right-wing media is covering the Pachamama, and there was nobody coming from that sort of like, what's the church's position on what happened in that ceremony. And that's kind of where we really started getting exposure. But I think one of the things that we're contemplating right now, because I think in the future, I would say right now, maybe 30% of our content, it really depends on who's doing most of the writing, but I'd say maybe like 30% of it is that polemical stuff. The liturgy wars, the doctrinal questions, we've been doing a lot more on Vatican II. Um, but I think I'd like to present it more in a, I'd like to teach Catholics more about Vatican II, and less in a let's argue against the trad arguments, and more of like, this is the stuff that you haven't learned. This is, this was what the intentions were behind the Second Vatican Council. One of the things that I've learned, I don't know how much further there is really to go with the polemics and the traditionalist movement. They seem to take great notice of us, and sometimes their influence in the church is, or their influence on our work is disproportionate to the size of their movement. And I think to some degree, I mean, especially the radical traditionalists, I think to some degree they've served as a distraction. And I'm sure they will continue to do so. And I mean, part of that is because we've got a lot of writers that are former traditionalists or former semi-traditionalists. And it's just sort of what we gravitate towards. But I think in terms of, spiritual uplifting pieces, catechetical pieces, and just sort of teaching about history and theology is kind of where I want to go forward. I don't know that I want to be, I don't think that I ever really set out to be a polemical figure. It's funny because Stephen Walford was the inspiration, but I was thinking his book came out, I think, in August of 2018, and we launched in early 2018. And so even with like the little group of contributors that we had, the first thing that we wanted to deal with was the dubia and Amoris Laetitia, and just to sort of lay out a comprehensive case for the orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia. Then we figured Stephen Walford's book is going to come out. I knew that he had a preface from the Pope, and I was like, that's just going to blow people away, and his book came out. I think there was like a problem with the publisher getting it printed at the right time. And then the McCarrick scandal drops like the weekend before the book came out. And it's like, and so that sort of was like, oh, wow, this is like another, like, we thought that it was going to be a Amoris Laetitia centric. And once we kind of got over that hump, we just sort of write about what the Pope had to say and what the Pope and different Catholic topics. And then it became, and then, we did a lot of trench warfare. And I think Traditionis Custodes is the top of that hill, or I don't know what, this is sort of the last stand. It's a very interesting, I honestly was, and, to maybe preview our next podcast, I was shocked that it came out, to tell you the truth, or at least that it was as strong as it was. And then the Roche document shocked me again, because Pope Francis, despite the fact, I mean, you said you've read The Dictator Pope.
Yeah.
He never did anything to them. He let them do whatever they wanted for 8 years. And they just got angrier and angrier at him and called him names and accused him of more and more stuff. And he just sort of ignored them or took it. I guess there was that one story, the calling EWTN the work of the devil. Like, it seemed like leading up to that, maybe there was something going on. But the fact that he put out Traditionis Custodes, and I was like, wow, this is pretty strong. And then 2 or 3 months later, a lot of the American bishops had just waived it, basically said, we're going to do a dispensation in our diocese. Everyone can keep doing what they're doing. And I was like, oh, well, I guess it's, a dead letter. And then for that responsum to come out, before Christmas, I was like, wow, okay, they're committed. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But I think in terms of, dealing with radical traditionalism, I don't know that there's a ton more we could add to the site that's going to change the tide. If you can't even agree on basic principles of authority or of ecclesiology, there's really no it's really hard to have dialogue. So
Yeah, and this could be a episode itself because many traditionalists are using phrases such as the spirit of Vatican I and are questioning or becoming cynical or skeptical of Vatican I. And without getting too much into it, I mean, friends of mine like Eric Ybarra has written a few articles on this, and he has often said, I think very aptly and very insightfully, he says traditionalists' problem is not Vatican II, it's Vatican I.
yeah,
And he said if they're consistent logically, they'll trace it back to that issue. And these type of traditionalists, many
they
of them,
are.
yeah, 1 Peter 5 are doing that.
Yeah.
And Michael
I mean, it took them
Lofton,
long enough. I mean, I'd been saying that for a long time.
yeah, and Michael Lofton has made the comment in various discussions he's been in that this, if you're consistent, this will just lead you to orthodoxy. I think in a Facebook message we had the other day when you were talking about, different traditionalists saying they're going to break away or that put the Pope in schism. And I think I commented something like, you know what that's called? That's called Eastern Orthodoxy.
Oh yeah.
Like
Well,
that's a
there is that
different.
guy. What's his name? Ibriani, Richard something Ibriani. He's a former member of Most Holy Family Monastery, and but he's out in like New Mexico. I think he's in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico.
Oh yeah, I
And
used to live there.
you did, and well,
Yeah.
he's canceled every pope going back to like 1128, I think, so far.
Oh my gosh.
And but the Orthodox are all heretics, and all of the scholastics are heretics according to him. And I think Saint Jerome is an arch heretic in his opinion. So so
Okay.
you could roll it back, even further if you want to, but the crazy thing is it's like they won't leave though. And I mean, I'm not saying I want people to leave, but it's like Peter Kwasniewski. It's like, where is the Catholicism? Like I don't know if I showed you the article, like a breakaway
Yeah.
sect called
Yeah.
Peterism. Like, breaking away from what? If you're breaking away with Peter, how are you I mean, he didn't use the word schism because the definition of schism is to refuse submission to the Pope. But I mean, to him, it's like he wants to be in full communion with the institutional church, but he wants to give no obedience whatsoever or doctrinal credibility at all to the Pope. It doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, so that's it's a whole other show.
Yeah. Yeah. And love to have someone on like maybe Dave Armstrong or something. Because like I know he's written a lot about that.
Yeah.
So but
Yeah.
well, Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. Is there any plugs you'd like to give for what's coming up with you?
Yeah. So in February, I will be starting a podcast called Field Hospital, with produced by U.S. Catholic magazine out of Chicago. I will be co-hosting it with Jeannie Gaffigan,
Wait,
the
is that Jim Gaffigan's wife?
Jim Gaffigan's wife. She is. I don't know if you've heard the stand-up comedy where he's like, "I'm Catholic, but my wife is a Shiite Catholic."
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
that's not. Now, granted, we're a little bit more sensitive towards Muslim people on on the podcast, but basically, yeah, it's going to be an interview show. We've already started production for it. It's going to be every 2 weeks for 12 episodes, and then we'll see where it goes from there, starting in February. So Field Hospital, U.S. Catholic, and obviously always at Where Peter Is, and hopefully we'll get, now that, I mean, that it's funny because we were in talks for a very, very long time about getting the podcast going, and that's sort of why we started like the Where Peter Is live, and because it was like a whole year where we were like, this could happen at any time and totally change. And now that we finally have a we finally nailed it down, and it's finally happening. We can make some better decisions about where Peter is and what our media is coming out of where Peter is, in addition to the podcast. So lots of exciting stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I look forward to that. Look forward to having more conversations with you, and it'd be cool to eventually have in the future a roundtable with maybe you and Pedro and or David.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah,
Get the squad together.
get
But,
get the whole team together and have us hash out the oral history.
yeah. So. Hashtag squad goals. But well, Mike, I appreciate you coming on. Everyone, thank you very much for tuning in. I've been your host, James Doffinger Jr. This was episode 15. Thank you, everyone, and you have a great rest of your day or night or whenever you're listening to this.